All right, folks, so episode 9, season 8 of Alone, we're going to do a recap here. Now, I just want to kind of set the stage here. This episode covered the days kind of like the early 40s to maybe just after 50. We're getting into that late October period. And this episode, finally, we get to the point where we can actually set out our gill nets. We couldn't set gill nets out till day 45 per the regulations we had to follow. But we finally get there. We're getting into some colder weather. We had a pretty good cold snap when we got down into the single digits. Things start to freeze up. The nights are getting long, the days are getting short, and that can wear on you. So we start out with Biko, which I thought was a pretty kind of a funny little scene. He's sitting inside of a shelter. He's in good spirits, but you can actually, like, it's snowing inside of his shelter. The snow's blowing, the wind's blowing, and it's blowing that dry snow through the cracks in his shelter. And so he spends some time going and getting moss up and chinking all the cracks between his logs. And I did the same thing. I would have, there was lots of moss on top of the rocks there around my site, and it looks like on Biko's site too. And so you can gather up these big bunches of moss and just use that to stuff between the logs to seal everything up. So Biko talks a lot about, keeping his mind busy. He talks a lot about the mental side, and that's something that, when you spend that much time alone, and not only that, but you have the weather's kind of closing in, the weather's getting crappy, the days are getting short, you have less melatonin production and all of that stuff. It can be easy. It can be very easy to get down, especially as he talks about later on when you experience failure after failure after failure. That type of stuff just weighs on you. And you're, on top of all of that, you are literally starving. Your body is consuming itself. And so maintaining, it's impossible to be positive all the time. But not letting yourself dive into those very low spots, that's incredibly important. If you do that, it's real easy to tap that button and go home because it's right there. So Biko also gets his gill net finished, and it looks great. It looks like he used the overhand knot method, which is kind of the predominant method for making, or the predominant methods that's shown and taught for making like survival gill nets. I didn't use that method. I showed in a previous video that I put up here on like net making 101 or something like that. I actually carved a net needle and made a gauging card and made my net using that technique. It's interesting to see how different people attack different problems. I'll also talk about Colter here in a little bit. Colter did something a little bit different with his net, which I found was very, very interesting. And so Biko sets his gill net out using the method that I think was Nathan Donnelly first used on season 6, where he just cut a long pole, attach the net to the pole, and then push that pole out. That's a good way to do it, but it limits you in how far you can get your net out. We'll see how that ends up working out in the long run. All right, so we're gonna move on to Colter. Now, right off the bat, Colter finds some kind of bird floating in the lake. I couldn't tell from the footage what that was, but he opens it up. There's worms all inside of it, but he decides to go ahead, gut it, and then just take the meat and basically stew it down or boil it really well. And that should kill everything that's in there. You can eat some pretty questionable stuff if you cook it well enough. I mentioned this in a previous recap video, but I actually found a spruce grouse that was washed up on my beach, and it was the morning after a particularly windy night. And I think what happened was that grouse just got blown out of a tree, blown out over the lake, which was miles wide. It was middle of the night, I'm sure. Landed in the lake, drowned, and then washed up on my beach, and it was perfect. I mean, there was nothing wrong with that grouse at all. But I think the most interesting thing that that we see Colter doing is he makes his gill net out of monofilament. So the fishing line that he was able to bring, that's what he ended up using to make his gill net. And I found that very interesting because in my preparation to go out there before we ever even got to BC, I'd done a lot of research on gill nets, and everything that I could find seemed to point to monofilament having basically a higher catch rate than like a nylon net. And I think that's primarily due to the visibility. Like if you look at Biko's net and my net, it's just, you know, I actually dyed mine with alder bark, which turned it that orange color. But still, it's very, very visible when you put it in that very clear water. Colter's, on the other hand, is much, much less visible. I looked into trying to make a gill net out of monofilament, and I just couldn't figure out how to do it. I actually didn't think that I would have enough monofilament. And it looks, from what I can see, it looks like Colter's gill net might be a little bit smaller than what mine is. So I don't know if he just ran out of material and couldn't make it any bigger, or if that's just the size that he decided to make it. But it looks like it's working out well for him. And I would say that anybody that's going on future seasons, I would definitely look into, like, if you're able to use gill nets, I would definitely look into how to use monofilament to make a gill net, because, like I said, the catch rates, in all the research that I've seen, the catch rates are just higher in clear water. Now, another interesting thing that Colter does with his gill net, I mean, this is his strategy from day one. His strategy is to use this boat in combination with his gill net, make it to day 45, and go out and set this gill net with his boat. Now, the way he sets it, I was very impressed with. This is more like the way that professional gill netters set their nets. So he had weights on the bottom, he had floats on the top, and he had some way that he could suspend his net. So the floats are going to drag the net up in the water column, and the weights are going to hold the bottom. And so he had all this system set so that it would be sitting about 5 feet off the bottom. Now, one of the big reasons that he did that, I think, is because he didn't want the bottom of the net getting caught on anything that could have been on the bottom of the lake. Big stones, logs, things like that. And he mentions those things. I don't know exactly how he managed that net without getting everything tangled up, because I was having problems with my weight rocks getting tangled, my floats were getting tangled. I mean, it was a real pain in the butt with things getting tangled up with all the weights and everything, but it looks like he got it figured out. He gets his gill net set, and then he goes out there and checks it and hauls up 2 giant trout. And we can see, I mean, he's super excited about it, and I know exactly how he felt. It's unlike anything you've ever experienced. After going that long and not eating anything of any kind of substance, and then all of a sudden just to have this bounty dropped into your lap, it's a feeling like no other. So moving on to Theresa. Now, right off the bat, we get to see Theresa put on that awesome parka that she made. Now, Theresa does all of this stuff herself. She does the bark tanning, the brain tanning. You can see that there's different colors of leather on that parka that she made. Part of that's bark tan. It's all done primitive, all with primitive tanning techniques, and she does amazing work. It's all hand sewn. It's all like Arctic fox on the inside, and it's just it's a pretty amazing piece of clothing, and it's all hand done. I don't know how many hours she has into that thing, but it looks great. You know, I've done some of that myself. When I was in college, I actually made a full outfit out of brain tan buckskins made from the hides from the deer that I had killed with my self bow. And I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think I had 6 hides in the pants and the shirt. It was all hand sewn with sinew. And so having done some of that stuff, I know how much work goes into the things that she took out there with her. And she doesn't, like I said, she does a great job on those things. So Theresa also makes a fish trap that is designed specifically for small fish. So you can see it's a very well-made fish trap. You can see that the slats are very fine and they're very close together. It's one of the better fish traps that we've seen made on the entire series. And I think the strategy that she's going for there, targeting those small fish, is a good one, because there were lots of little small fish that were in close to the shore. The problem that she runs into is the retrieval system. You know, with the weather on that lake and the waves and the shallow water. So when the waves push up, you know, they hit that shallow water and then they just start breaking. And it creates problems with everything. I mean, Colter's having trouble with his boat. I start having trouble with my gill net. Theresa's having trouble with her fish trap, and she ends up, towards the end, she ends up just losing the whole thing and kind of calling it seems anyway, like she's calling it quits on fishing, which is discouraging. But you know, the waves on that lake just make everything difficult. All right, so we can finally get to myself, and right off the bat you see me setting up the retrieval and the deployment system for my gill net. And I basically used a clothesline system very similar to what Theresa used to set out her trot line earlier on in the series. Out in the lake I had an anchor rock, and then I had a paracord tied up to a float, and then to that float I had a ring. And so that was out in the lake. And I actually put that out, I don't know, probably the second week, so it was still pretty warm. I tied my anchor rock to a big log, swam that thing out there, and then cut the line and dropped the anchor, which had that set out in the lake. I did that while it was still warm out there. From that, I had a paracord that was looped through that, back to that tripod system that you saw me make. And so I had this continuous loop of paracord between these two opposing rings, one out in the lake and one on the shore. And so the idea was just to take my gill net, tie it to one of these lines, and then I could be able to clothesline it in and clothesline it back out. In theory, it worked great, but when you add in the realities of the wind and the waves, the rocks on the bottom of that lake, the ice, the cold weather, things just didn't work out the way that I had envisioned them working out. My weights, I had rocks on the bottom of my gill net for weights to keep the bottom down. And when I tried to pull the net out, those weights would get caught down in the big boulders on the bottom of the lake and make it very hard to get the net out and get the net back in. My lines were getting tangled up. Everything was getting frozen together. My pulleys were getting frozen up. And so it just wasn't working out. Now, you see towards the end of that, I get pretty frustrated, pretty fed up with it, and basically just say the hell with it and throw it down and walk off. In this episode, I also talk about my oldest boy, Coy, how he's one of my biggest motivating factors for being out there and how I want to set a good example for him. And then here I am getting frustrated about my gill net not working out the way that I wanted it to. Instead of just accepting the way things were and looking for an alternate path forward, I was letting those external events dictate my mood. I was letting those things get to me. I was letting myself get frustrated, and that's not what I went out there to do. That's not the example that I wanted to set for my boys. You know, ideally, you don't want to get frustrated. You want to take a step back, pull out of that emotion, take a step back and just look at things objectively and look for an alternate way forward. That's the ideal mode of being, right? But when you're in that situation and imagine all of the things weighing down on you. You're cold, you're hungry, the weather sucks, the days are getting short. you know, it's easy to understand how you can get frustrated. And I think it's not the end of the world to get frustrated. It's not, I think it's okay to get frustrated. What's not okay is to let yourself be defeated. And so we'll see. We'll see how this turns out. We'll see if the gill net defeats me, I guess, in the next episode. But anyway, let me know what you guys think. If you have any questions on what I talked about here, or anything that I've talked about, or anything that you've seen on the show, let me know in the comments below, and I really try to answer all the comments. I'll try to get back to it. But with that, we will see you guys next Thursday, just before episode 10, 4 p.m. Pacific. Stay tuned.